Hello and welcome back to The Anecdotalist, episode 12. I'm your host, Paul Packard, and with me today, as always, my co host, Jason McKinney.
How's it going, everybody?
So we've cycled back around to our UFO encounters. And no, we're not spending this episode on Alcatraz, but if there ever is a UFO sighting around Alcatraz, we might as well go back and do that episode because we've already done the other topics. But tonight we're talking about the 1952 UFO incident over Washington, D.C. Some call it an invasion, others call it an incident. I think later, Jason, when we do our recap, we'll land on what we think it is. But invasion feels like a strong word. And keeping with our gentle reminders to keeping these intros short, we're going to jump right in. So, Jason, are you ready?
Let's do it.
Okay, here we go. On the night of July 19th, 1952, radar from Washington National Airport picked up 7 objects flying over DC in what was described as radical movement, stopping to hover over the White House and the U.S. Capitol. At 3 a.m., U.S. fighter jets were in the air and over D.C., but the objects disappeared. After running out of fuel and returning to base, the objects reappeared on radar before leaving again. They would be back.
Wow, man. So this is like one of those things where it's back to those ships and moving in sporadic movements. I know that's one of the coolest things about, you look over these UFO reports and all of them tend to describe these ships. They can do things that, movements that normal planes can't do. So it's kind of cool that we're seeing this once again, but it's also kind of scary that it's over the US Capitol.
Yeah, the radical movement thing is very interesting. And it's funny because that comes up again and again and again with these UFO encounters. And it's funny because now we're on what, like our third UFO episode, or a third UFO series. And I told you at the very beginning, this is a very common phenomenon when it comes to UFOs, because one easy way to have an object that is unidentifiable is an object that doesn't move like aircraft that we would know of, or aircraft that would even be around at this time. So yeah, this is another instance of these objects moving in radical movement, and we're going to get way more into detail here soon. You're right. Yeah, we're back at it with the different movement, basically physics bending movement. So we're going to get into Project Blue Book again. We're not going to go into a ton of detail here. We've covered Blue Book before, and I think in our Betty and Barney Hill abduction series, we talked about the history of Blue Book. So we'll leave that there, but we're definitely going to touch on it because it does play a significant role here. To put things in perspective and to do this story justice, we need to start by first talking about the 1947 Kenneth Arnold incident. And so that kind of sets the stage for this so-called invasion of DC. In June of 1947, a C-46 aircraft carrying 32 U.S. Marines went down near Mount Rainier in Washington state. And Kenneth Arnold was flying around the area in hopes of finding the downed plane and basically claiming the $5,000 reward. What he found instead was a series of 9 disc-like objects flying in formation, traveling at roughly 1,200 to 1,700 miles per hour. Both speeds have been reported, so just kind of keep that in mind. Either way, this was months before the Bell X-1 with Colonel Chuck Yeager would break the sound barrier, traveling at 700 miles an hour. So these vehicles were traveling double that speed and flying in an echelon formation, which is basically a diagonal flight path. Think if you've seen like military planes flying in a line, like they're cocked at an angle. Another source said they were flying in a V formation. But either way, they were flying in some type of formation. These disc-like objects were flying in formation over Mount Rainier at a speed no human craft had done, and they were emitting bright lights.
So here's my question: if these 9 disc flying objects, they were traveling at roughly 1,200 to 1,700 miles per hour. I wonder how he was able to record these speeds. Like, does he fly Like, how do you know how he recorded these speeds?
See, that's an interesting question. I've wondered that myself. I think they have technology at the time, or they had technology at the time that allowed them to like measure like point A to point B, and then basically math out the amount of time it takes to get from one location from to another. But yeah, that was my first thought too. Was like, how does he know they're going that fast? But I think there's some technology that allows for them to say, okay, if they're crossing this path at this time and then crossing this path at this time, we can then math out the speed at which they're traveling. And whatever that shook out to was about 1200 or 1700 miles an hour, somewhere in that window.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and the other thing that's really interesting about this is if you remember Project Blue Book, it ran from 1952 to 1969, but it was preceded by Project Sign in 1947 and Project Grudge in 1949. So Project Sign was just initiated, and there was hope that like they could start gathering more and more of these sightings. And so this sighting actually spurred a Life magazine coverage titled, quote, "Have we visitors from outer space?" And the hope was that there was going to be some type of uptick in public interest in UFO sightings and reportings. And it did. This is kind of the beginning of the flying saucers, flying discs. This was that kind of turning point for that. And just a few years later, 1952 is when all the Washington D.C. UFO stuff happens. But this first interaction with Kenneth Arnold and the report that he had of the 9 disc objects, this is kind of the first beginnings of what we now know as like flying saucers, essentially. So there was another incident kind of similar to this. And again, we're leading up to 1952 at this point. In 1948, in Fort Knox, another UFO is picked up on radar. Now, this story is super interesting, and there's some similarities to what happened over DC in 1952. So we'll come back to that here in a little bit. But for over an hour, this craft hovers over the gold depository at Fort Knox. That's the largest gold reserve in the US. It currently has about 147 million ounces of gold. And in 1941, at its peak, it held 650 million ounces of gold, which is a little over like 40 million pounds of gold. So this was where the US stored a ton of precious metals. And this craft in 1948 basically parks right over top of it for about an hour. We're in this weird period of these UFOs being sighted. They're kind of like flying saucers, and there's one after another like sighting, and they're moving, getting more and more frequent.
Yeah, and it seems like they're becoming more frequent in areas that, our government has the most interest in.
Yeah, that's what's really interesting about it is that these UFOs, these flying saucers, whatever they were at the time, they're in areas of like high visibility, high like government visibility. And so it's kind of like, okay, why would it sit over that much gold? Why specifically Fort Knox? We all know Fort Knox as like the pinnacle of security for you're not getting into Fort Knox. You kind of wonder why those locations. So 3 P-51 Mustangs from the Kentucky Air National Guard, they're all scrambled and they chase the craft to like 22,000 feet. So 2 fighters, they end up turning back. Captain Thomas Mantell, he continues chasing it. So they lose contact with Mantell, and they basically just find his wreckage of his aircraft about 5 miles outside of Franklin, Kentucky. So he goes down chasing this UFO. The Air Force basically said he was either chasing Venus or, according to Project Blue Book, he was chasing a top secret atmospheric research balloon called Skyhook.
Interesting. So I wonder if it was an atmospheric research balloon. I mean, I would think that it'd be flying straight up. I mean, it's not like they can fly that fast, right? I don't know how fast a hot air balloon, because I mean that's what I'm picturing, right?
Yeah, it sounds like a kind of it's like the classic weather balloon excuse, right? Like whenever there's a UFO and they're like, "Oh, it was a weather balloon, a research balloon." It kind of feels that way. And you're right. You would assume that if people were seeing a craft sitting over Fort Knox for an hour, and then when these fighter jets show up, it climbs quickly to 22,000 feet. And the P-51 Mustang, I mean, they're not jets. They have, the Packard Merlin engine in them, so they're fairly quick. But like They're like the World War II fighters. They're prop planes. So they're not flying as fast as jets are, but you would assume that like if it was a balloon, they wouldn't be chasing it 22,000 feet. That just feels odd to me that they're chasing it, but it's like a balloon. I don't know, but it feels fishy. And this actually kind of comes up later after the 1952 incident. So just kind of keep this in your back pocket. Think about this for later as well.
Okay, very interesting.
So again, official UFO research supported by the government was just taken off at the time. And so in 1952, that was when Project Blue Book kicks off. And in June, July of that year, UFO sightings were like at an all-time high. And July saw a record 400 sightings. And something was going on, and there was an incredible uptick in UFO sightings. It was like they called it the UFO flap of 1952. There was just a lot of activity happening at this time. Just before the night of July 19th, according to the book Invasion Washington UFOs Over the Capitol by author Kevin D. Randle, there was a scientist who I didn't see named, and it kind of felt like a throwaway line here, but he predicted the UFO sightings, saying to Ed Ruppelt, who was the head of Project Blue Book. Remember the guy that died of a heart attack at age 37 from when we talked about this last time? That was really suspicious. So he was really heavily involved in this incident. He said to him, quote, "Within the next few days, they're, referring to the flying saucers, are going to blow up, and you're going to have the granddaddy of all UFO sightings. The sighting will occur in Washington or New York, probably Washington." End quote.
Interesting. I do not remember this guy. Who was he? I mean, you said he's the head of Project Blue Book.
Yeah, so he was the head of Project Blue Book. I think he was like the really early days of Project Blue Book because he was over Project Sign and Project Grudge. And he was the guy. Remember, we talked about how he mysteriously he died of a heart attack at the age of 37, which was super suspicious because he was heavily involved in all this like top secret stuff with UFOs, and then he dies at a like really young age. I think he ended up dying before Project Blue Book was even like wrapped up. He basically ran the UFO investigation stuff at this time. So on the night of July 19th, there was the granddaddy of all UFO sightings. At 11:40 p.m., an air traffic controller by the name of Edward Nugent, notified senior air traffic controller Harry C. Barnes of 7 blips clustered together on radar, moving first at only 100 miles an hour, accelerating suddenly to speeds of upwards of 7,000 miles an hour. They weren't in any formation, and it seemed to kind of burst at random speeds, causing their radar pips to come and go. So what will happen on radar is, you know how in the old school radar it's like that green circle that like kind of rotates around the screen. They were saying that these craft were moving so quickly that they appeared to kind of like jump around the screen because they were moving so fast that the radar was having a hard time like tracking them, I guess.
Oh wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, so like in effect they were disappearing from the scope because they were so quick. So they tested the equipment. They were like, okay, this has got to be a problem. Something's going on with the equipment, but it wasn't broken. And so they even like just looked out the window. They're like, okay, if something's out there, we'll see it outside. So they poke their heads out the window and they see the objects with the naked eye. They're seeing bright orange lights in the sky, but no other like defining characteristics at this point. And if you remember like the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, they recalled seeing the craft flying away, and remember they described it as a bright orange light. This is like really similar to that. They were seeing balls of orange light kind of just flying around the area.
Oh wow, that is kind of scary when you think about it. I wonder if like they're kind of wondering, well, maybe this is angels.
Yeah, you got to imagine that they look outside and they see these orange balls just kind of cruising around in the air. And you got to imagine they probably think, okay, these can't be aircraft by the way they're moving. They're flying so fast that a radar can barely keep up. Well, I don't know what you would think. If I looked outside and saw like balls of fire flying around the air, yeah, maybe I think it was something supernatural, like I don't know, ghosts, angels, UFOs. You got to imagine they're probably thinking they're racking their brains like we have no vehicles or crafts that can fly like this right now. What the heck could these actually be?
Jeez, that is so scary, man. And the fact that there's more than one.
Yeah, it's not just one object; it's a bunch of objects. So because of this, Barnes, he ends up calling Andrews Air Force Base. And he's like, hey, are you guys tracking anything on your radar? And they're like, nope. We just have a C-47. It's about an hour outside of Washington. We got nothing else. So Barnes is like, well, just go outside and look up because there's something going on above your base. So an airman goes outside. His name is William Brady. And he looks up and he sees, quote, an object which appeared to be like an orange ball of fire, trailing a tail. It appeared to be about 2 miles south and 1.5 miles from Andrews' range. It was very bright and definite, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It took off at an unbelievable speed. End quote. So basically just took off so fast. The way he describes it is that it just vanishes from sight because it was so quick, which is wild. And what's really funny about this too, when I read about this particular instance where this guy, William Brady, goes outside, he's like yelling. He's like, hey guys, come look at this. And everything happens so quickly by the time everybody else gets outside, they don't see anything. So he kind of sounds crazy because they don't have anything on radar and they don't see anything in the sky. But this guy, William Brady, is like, I saw something. I swear I saw something outside.
Dude, that is crazy. Like, I wonder, obviously this couldn't be a comet because I mean, it was there for a second and then it disappeared. I mean, that's scary, dude. That gives me chills.
Yeah, a comet is pretty lengthy and permanent. Like that's something that's traveling around, like orbiting the sun. But like you maybe a meteor, right? Like it's coming in, it's burning up in the atmosphere. Maybe that. I've seen some pretty crazy stuff. There's that video floating around right now of I think oh man, I don't know, some northern European country that had the meteor that flew through and it's like really bright in the sky. It's like a yellowish green. Maybe something like that. But yeah, the way that he talks about it and describes it and the other descriptions from other people make it seem like okay, yeah, if it was a meteor burning up in the atmosphere, it would be a trail. Like you would see it burn up and disappear. The way he talks about it is like it's a ball of fire. This one specifically does have a tail, but it zips away and vanishes.
Wow, man. That is creepy.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So now it's 2 a.m. and radar officer Captain Harold C. Way, he learns of a target east of Andrews. So, like Brady, he just goes outside and looks up. He describes seeing craft flashing from red to orange and to green and then back to red. He said that it was rapidly ascending and descending. The tower operator at Bowling Air Force Base also saw a roundish object flying in the sky. So Randle includes this sighting in his book specifically because it implicates a third government institution involved in the sightings. So three different locations, Andrews, Bowling, and then Washington National, all are seeing either on radar or by the naked eye aircraft or some kind of craft flying around in the sky.
So it's kind of scary that this is all government sightings, you know? Like that just makes me think that they're over our bases, you know? They're looking at our stuff to see like what technology, what weapons we have.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it kind of reminds you of like the Rendlesham Forest episodes that we did where they're over the bases. It's like, well, it always goes back to, like Area 51, right? When out west, these things always happen around military bases. And there's one or two reasons for that. It's craft, like top secret craft that the U.S. government has and is not, they're basically saying, oh, I don't know what it is, but it's their stuff. Or it's some type of extraterrestrial intelligent life coming to a location where the technology is, or where there's like concentrations of technology. It's one or two things. And in this case, even beyond that, it's like the head of our government, not just like military bases, but like our government. They're flying over the White House. Harry Truman's, sleeping next to his wife in bed, and those aircrafts, there's like UFOs flying around. It's so wild because yeah, it's around our bases, it's in our nation's capital, and it's happening so much that there's even people that are civilians that aren't part of the government that are seeing these things just flying around Washington D.C. And some of them are saying like they're seeing these round objects and varying flashing lights just all through the night sky.
Man, that is scary.
So in the official Project Blue Book document, there's evidence that military jets attempted to intercept the crafts, but they couldn't. And even commercial airline pilots claim to have seen these flying objects all through the night sky. And so eventually a pair of F-94 jets, they take off to this area and the crafts disappear. The jets, after a time, they run out of fuel and they basically have to land. And when they do that, the crafts come right back and they all reappear. At 3:30 a.m., Staff Sergeant Charles Davenport reported seeing a bluish white object moving erratically above the tree line. And he said 3 times a red object left the silvery object at a high rate of speed.
Oh wow, dude. So I wonder if there's like some kind of like hierarchy in these colors of these ships. Because we have a bluish white object, a red object, silver object.
I don't know. I think like the bluish white object and silver is kind of like mixed together. I think with those, he's close enough to that craft to actually see the metallic outer shell, I guess. And then the red objects are lights flying. So yeah, I don't know. It is really interesting that there are different colors here associated here. But I think the bluish white and the silver, this comes up again. I think that's just like the outer shell of some type of craft, is what they're seeing.
Interesting. I wonder if the red objects are just like silver, like fully silver, but like the sun is just reflecting off them.
Well, this is at 3 a.m., so there's no sun.
Oh, good point.
It kind of like, I think of it as, if you think of like Star Trek, which I always go back to, you have the main ship and then you have like the shuttlecrafts that like will land in the docking bay and then take off. Thinking of it through that lens, like what if there's a main object that houses everything, and then you have little crafts that take off and do their thing and then come back and then land. I know I look at things in this capacity through like the lens of Star Trek because that's what I do. But like that was my first thought was, okay, well that kind of makes sense if you have one like mothership and you have all these other smaller crafts like shuttlecrafts that come and go from it.
Dude, that makes a lot of sense. You know what's funny though is we're gonna find out one day that Star Trek is based off like the real thing.
Yeah. So Barnes, the senior air traffic controller from earlier, he counted upwards of 10 objects, all kind of flying erratically. He basically is like, they were most active around the planes they had on the scope. So if a commercial plane was flying, these little radar blips were just all kind of hovering around these planes. And he said something like they were like a bunch of kids outside playing. They are moving around the planes as if driven by like curiosity. But there's no rhyme or reason. They would cluster all together at times, and in other intervals, they would just kind of scatter and fly around. He basically says the movements they were making could not be attributed to any known craft. They were making gyrations and turns that our aircraft just couldn't make. We talked about this earlier, right? It's the rapid shifting that our physics can account for. Like when a plane flies right now, it can't just immediately start going the opposite way. It was making turns and things that the aircraft at the time could not do. He also goes on to like rule out weather or astronomical phenomenon based on the movements and the length of time. So Barnes also claims that these objects were listening in on the comms, which I think is really interesting because he was saying that whenever they would tell or communicate to a pilot to look out one side of the window, hey, you got a bogey on your left. When they would do that, these objects would rapidly move away from the plane as if they were hearing him communicating with the pilot.
Man, that's kind of scary on more ways than one. I mean, the fact that we have somebody that can like listen in on our comms, that I think should scare us more than what, it probably does. I mean, also the fact that these aircrafts can move in ways that ours can't. Oh my gosh, man. I don't know. If I were up there flying, I would probably be trying to get out of there. I probably would not stay around and investigate.
Well, these people aren't up there investigating. These are commercial airlines. The tower's like, hey, we got some crazy stuff going on here in DC. Are you seeing these things? There are instances and reports of these pilots seeing the craft flying around. But yeah, they're not investigating. They're just doing their normal flights coming into DC, and there's craft. There's things flying around in the air in their airspace.
I'm kind of surprised that the military didn't try to shoot him down or like scare him off.
Well, the thing that's really interesting that I read is that these craft that so like there's those two fighter jets that get scrambled. They show up. There's not really a whole lot of like homeland security when it comes to scrambling fighter jets at the time. It takes them a long time to get to the location. They're not flying out of DC. I think they're flying. I can't remember the exact base they're coming out of, but that was something that gets mentioned a couple times. Is that it takes a while for these jets to even get to the airspace where these things are flying around. When they do get there, they can't catch the crafts that are flying around, but two, they disperse when they show up. So yeah, it's really interesting because you think they're trying to catch them, but they're trying to catch them, and if they can't catch them, they're trying to shoot them down, but there's nothing they can shoot down or catch because these crafts are so quick that whenever they get close to them, they just zoom away or disappear.
Wow, man, that is scary.
So that's night one. And night two gets a bit more interesting. But before I get into that, I do want to talk about something else that occurred that first night on the other side of the country. So as I was doing the research, I found a video from a channel called Event Horizon. And so I've not watched or vetted any of this content from this guy, but this video is really interesting. It's about 40 minutes long. The host, John Michael Gaudier, he interviews astrophysicist Dr. Beatrice Villarreal. It covers transient objects captured utilizing telescopes. And I would suggest you go and give it a watch. It's because it's very intriguing, and I'm not going to be able to explain all of it here, but I want to touch on it at least. This particular episode is about a set of plates taken from Mount Palomar Observatory in Southern California. These two plates, taken 1 hour apart on the night of July 19th, 1952, at 9 p.m. Pacific and 10 p.m. Pacific, appear to capture a transient phenomenon. So there's a lot that goes into this. So a transient phenomenon, especially like in regards to space, is a really rare occurrence, as space doesn't change very often. Now we run into the issue of like capturing the images of man-made objects and space debris, because when you're talking about capturing images of like stars and things, you're not expecting to get an object in one frame and then it be missing from the next frame. That doesn't really happen that often because stars don't change or disappear in an hour. And at this time, there's no like space debris or man-made objects in space. Sputnik doesn't even launch into orbit until October of 1957. So there's no satellites in space at this time. So that's something that comes up now where like transient objects could potentially be space junk or satellites or whatever. But at this time, there shouldn't be transient objects. But in 1952, there was a plate taken at 9 p.m. and one at 10 p.m. and one has images of it and of something and one doesn't.
So, what are these plates? Is plates like a way of picture?
Yeah, so a plate is like it's basically like a picture for all intents and purposes. And you have the aperture open for a certain amount of time to capture a certain amount of light, so that they enough exposure to capture stars in the sky, right? They just call them plates. I'm not sure exactly what they look like, but they're essentially pictures, and so they're capturing these images on a plate. And so in this specific scenario, one plate has like star-like objects on it, and the next plate is missing those starlight objects. Basically, two pictures taken an hour apart with different images in them.
Very interesting.
This specific transient is a cluster of three bright objects. And when looking at the image, you wouldn't even think twice. It just looks like a cluster of stars. But when side by side of other images taken of that region of space, you realize, okay, those shouldn't be there. Villarreal, she's published a paper alongside colleagues that investigates this further, including new images taken of the region of space, like just not that long ago, with modern high-powered telescopes, and there's nothing there. So you can go online and read about or look at or find these images, and I suggest you go and watch the video because it's really interesting. But basically, what they're saying is that they were looking at pictures taken from this observatory of the sky the night that these UFOs showed up in DC, and there's three star-like objects that show up.
So, here's my question though: is if it like if there's star-like objects, could star-like objects not just be stars? And don't we know stars to just combust?
Not in that amount of time.
Three of them at the same time.
Yeah, a star wouldn't go supernova and disappear within an hour. From what we see, our view of a star light years away when it goes supernova is it gets brighter and brighter and bigger before it fades. I think it's a long enough amount of time that maybe even a lifetime. Like if one were to explode today, we would see the result of that explosion for years and years and years. I don't know how long, but it wouldn't be over the course of 1 hour, and it definitely wouldn't be 3 stars.
So what could they possibly be then?
Several things. First, space debris or man made objects, which in this specific case doesn't really make sense because it was 1952, but transients typically are either like man made objects like satellites. It could also be like a malfunction of the plate, or there could be a plate flaw, which is the case with some other transients. However, this specific transient and what they talk about in the video here, it doesn't really give the same signs as what you would typically see. They're just too big and too bright. They're too star-like to be plate flaws. It could also be a previously unknown space phenomenon that we just haven't discovered yet. It could literally be an image of a new discovery, but it's just one image, so who knows? And so the work that Villarreal is doing is basically investigating these phenomenon further by attempting to capture a transient with multiple telescopes in the hopes of triangulating the phenomenon, which hasn't been done yet. There's never been a transient taken with multiple scopes. It's only ever been just one. And so in this case, of course, it looks like three bright stars. I don't know. It could be aliens. I mean, who's to say? We have no idea. It is something that we don't know. And the implication from this video and the timing of all this, how it's played out with all the UFO sightings in 1952, especially that night, is it was a cluster of crafts coming to Earth, which is a wild implication. There's no like really sure way of knowing the proximity of this phenomenon. So they talk about how this image is taken, and there's only one telescope taking this picture, so they can't really triangulate where it's at. But they basically say they feel like, or based on the image, it was fairly close to Earth, like in the grand scheme of things. It could have even been as close as our own atmosphere, but there's no way again of knowing what that is. And that's a whole rabbit hole we can go down, but I suggest you go to the channel. It's called Event Horizon, hosted by John Michael Gaudier, and I just thought it was really interesting that it lined up with this UFO encounter. And so I suggest going and watching it. It's really intriguing, but it just adds a whole nother layer to this whole thing.
I mean, that's awesome that we have these plates to have proof of this.
It's very coincidental that they were to have taken these images, one, only 1 hour apart, which isn't super normal, but two, the same night that all these UFOs were showing up in DC. So there's like a rare glimpse of the sky in a region of space that is unique the same day that there's UFOs flying over DC. So we're not even really done talking about the UFO sightings. So that was July 19th. The next Saturday, July 26th, it happens again. So at 2:30 p.m., an object was picked up on radar traveling at 2,600 miles an hour, just under 5,000 feet, which was the lower limit of radar. So what ends up happening is a craft flying at 5,000 feet. If it goes too much below 5,000 feet, it disappears off radar, and then above 5,000 feet, it shows up on radar. And that was just the limits of the technology at the time. So keep that in mind. 5,000 feet comes up a ton here, but this craft is flying right around 5,000 feet for about 2 minutes, and then it disappears. The operators at Langley Air Force Base near Washington, they witnessed a second object appear for about 4 minutes, stopping suddenly to hover for about 2 minutes before disappearing again. So presumably that disappearance is just coinciding with the object dropping below radar visibility of 5,000 feet. So they're not just like disappearing from radar, they're just sinking below where the radar can pick them up. And this happens a bunch. So a commercial airline spots what they describe as glowing lights in the sky, kind of similar to like a cigarette, I guess. If you ever see someone smoking a cigarette in like a dark room, it's like a red glow. That's how they describe it. And a little bit later, around 10:30, the same operators from Washington National from the July 19th incident, they spot unidentified objects moving around the skies on their scopes as well. So basically, everything's back. They called the tower, who confirmed they were reading the same stuff, and then they called Andrews Air Force Base again. And this time, Andrews Air Force Base are like, yeah, we're seeing these crafts too.
Once again, this is a situation where like we are having all these unidentified aircraft flying over our military bases.
Yeah, they're flying over sensitive areas, which you would imagine. Well, remember, like when we talked about Rendlesham Forest, we thought maybe it was the height of the Cold War, and how likely is it that it's an enemy of the U.S. government flying over sensitive areas? That's another whole can of worms you can get into, I think, here. But yeah, they are flying over one D.C., but two Air Force bases. So in this specific incident, there's a B-52 in the area, and so they basically are asked to investigate. They say they're not seeing anything, but they realize that every time they are told an object should be visible where they are, they're over the river, and below was a steamboat. So, which I don't really think steam would show up on radar, but it's significant enough that the B-52, when they're near the radar blips and they're not seeing anything outside their craft, they're hovering over or they're flying over a steamboat, which is kind of a weird thing. So keep that in mind because that might come up later. So F-94 fighters were again called up. And so they show up around midnight. The Pentagon was now involved. And Al Chop, who was the civilian Pentagon spokesperson, he's like, okay, the reporters in this room, you guys got to go. So they're in the radar room, these reporters are, and they're hoping just to get a glimpse or record something from that night because they're running with all these stories, right? And so Al Chop, he's this Pentagon spokesperson. He's like, okay, you guys got to go. And the claim is that they're operating classified intercept maneuvers with the F-94s, and they didn't want civilians privy to that information. But others claim that it was due to the fact that they thought these fighters were going to encounter aliens for the first time, and they didn't want a big room of reporters capturing that moment. They're like, get these guys out of here because we might be interacting with aliens for the very first time. Now they're tracking them something like 10 to 15 UFOs on radar with two fighters in the skies. However, when they first arrived, they disappeared. So when these two F-94s show up, like right when they get into range of where these craft are, all the radar screens that showed craft, they vanish. And so they basically said like it looks like someone's just wiping them off the screen essentially. And so the F-94s fly around. And so Chop, he recalls that one of the fighters wasn't having any luck seeing the craft, even though the radar put him near where they were. So they're like, hey, flight of this quadrant, we saw UFOs here. He's like, I got nothing. But the other pilot, Lieutenant William Patterson, he reports seeing a cluster of blue white light objects in the sky. The F-94s, they're stationed in Delaware. Oh, this is what I was talking about earlier. They're stationed far enough away. They're in Delaware. So they're limited on time and fuel. And they, after a certain amount of time, they have to go back. It is really interesting to me because, like, Lieutenant William Patterson, he sees a cluster of blue white light objects flying around the sky. So he's seeing the phenomenon in the air. But it's kind of hard to reconcile because Chop, he basically says they're gone off radar when these F-94s show up. But the F-94s, William Patterson, Lieutenant Patterson, he's seeing objects. So it's weird that they're off radar, but they're in visual contact with the craft. And maybe it's just because they're dropping below 5,000 feet. I really don't know. But it is really interesting that they're basically saying these are no longer on radar, but Lieutenant Patterson, he's still seeing the craft fly around.
So that's kind of scary that they like the UFOs. I wonder if they know when they're on radar and when they're not on radar.
Yeah, that's the other thing is like, do they know they're like zipping below 5,000 feet? Are they actually taking off because they know U.S. military craft is showing up? But it is weird because they do fly around the commercial plane with no problem. And what's really interesting is that, and we're going to get to this later when we talk about the investigation. Patterson later goes on to say that they release all the records of the communication that was happening. Patterson at the time, he says he sees these lights, he chases them, he can't catch up to them, and then all of a sudden they're all around him. So that happens in the investigation. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, it's weird that they either a know they're on radar or they can hear the chatter from the tower. Why do they need to take off or leave? they have full control. It seems like they are playing with these planes at this point. So why even leave if it doesn't really matter to you, right? If you have superior technology.
Yeah, that is kind of strange. I wonder if they didn't know that our technology is superior. Maybe they think that we have better technology than what we actually do.
I doubt that's the case because all we have are burning fossil fuels to travel at less than 700 miles an hour, and they have the ability to travel to our Earth and to fly around. If you're looking at it through the lens of them being actual alien aircraft, there's no way they could perceive our technology as superior. If anything, they're just toying or playing with the military. So Ruppelt of Project Blue Book, and his book, it talks about the incident. So reports from civilians across DC saw lights in the sky. So alternating colors and flashing. The tower operator saw these as well. Something like 24 people called the newspaper claiming to have seen lights in the sky. They were disc-like objects flashing red and silver and green and hovering under 5,000 feet. And so, again, 5,000 feet keeps coming up. It comes up a ton in reference to this incident. And mostly, I think it just has to do with 5,000 is kind of a reference point for radar. So, whenever they talk about these objects, they always seem to be right around 5,000 feet. And maybe that's why they bounce off radar so quickly because they're diving down below radar visibility when an aircraft comes into the airspace. But that's why they seem to kind of disappear very rapidly because they're right at the edge of radar visibility. The other part of this is that there was another F-94 that just kind of happened to be in the air that night. So he said he sees lights when he turns towards, he approaches it. He said the light goes out almost immediately, like someone just is flipping a light switch. So this pilot actually ends up chasing the object and is able to get radar locks on a couple of times. But this F-94 is not the same two that showed up that were scrambled. It just happened to be in the air and happened to just kind of pull in basically to the airspace where these craft were flying around. At about 2 a.m., Langley Tower operators see a bluish white glowing object climbing from a fairly low level up to about 5,000 feet. Again, that mark where the radar is. Then this object just disappears. And it was around this time that jets get back into the air and attempt to pursue lights in the sky. This time they have a little bit more success, and they basically all just kind of fly around DC trying to catch up to these lights, but they're never able to actually get close to them. These guys are just basically chasing, almost like they're chasing ghosts. Like they just can never catch up to these lights. Like they see them off to the side, they jet after them, and they just can't catch up to them. And so this goes on for a period of time.
This wouldn't be nearly as scary if it wasn't for the fact that it's over our capital.
Yeah, that adds a whole another element to it. Like when people say, "Oh, in the sticks," the whole thing with UFOs showing up and like mutilating cows, you're kind of like, it was a cow. It was out in the middle of nowhere. But yeah, the fact that they're flying around over the Capitol, over the White House, that is pretty scary. It's like they're toying with supposedly the most protected area in the world, you would assume, and they're just toying with the military. So that's it. That's the 2 nights of UFO sightings over Washington. And at this point, we're going to kind of pivot over to like the immediate aftermath. We'll talk about the investigations and the theories, and then we'll just kind of wrap things up here. In the immediate aftermath, there's a press conference, and it's held at the Pentagon. There's like news stories all across the nation that UFOs have been sighted over Washington, that the military had pursued them. And basically, the press conference was the government's way of trying to contain all that information. So, one of the books that I have is called Reexamining 70 Years Later The Great Washington D.C. UFO Flap of 1952, an anthology of newspaper articles. So, that's by Kenneth Arnold. And it's literally just page after page of all these newspaper articles from that period of time that goes over all the sightings. It's really interesting. I don't really have any quotes or anything from it. Reading it kind of gives you a good little background, I guess. So it was kind of cool to see all these newspapers reacting to the reports they were getting out of DC and out of like from these civilians and stuff. So there was just a lot across the nation when it comes to newspapers covering this story. It was everywhere. So the US government's like, okay, let's hold a press conference. We're going to sit down and we're going to hammer this thing out and we're going to just have one story. During this press conference, reporters, they ask about Project Saucer, which was kind of the unofficial name given to Project Sign, Grudge, and ultimately Blue Book. So the public knew it as just Project Saucer. So the director of intelligence, Major General John Sanford, he kind of just downplays it. Basically, he's like, "Hey, well, we have this program. It's not really taken seriously. We do have it. It's for people that want to report UFOs. We don't take it seriously here in the bureau. It's just kind of, is what it is." And it's kind of like the classic presser where the government just does its best to answer questions, but really doesn't give any substance. So the press conference kind of points to a weather phenomenon. It points to astronomers who they don't really take UFOs seriously. Basically, to the average person, it felt like the government was just trying to brush everything under the rug. And they even actually, one of the reporters actually brings up Mantell's 1947 crash, and he's like, "Hey, you guys were withholding information about that. Who's to say you're not withholding information about this?" And they're like, "Oh, well," and they try to like spin it in a way like, "Oh, we didn't really withhold information." They basically just deny it. And so Sanford goes through this, and Ruppelt's there, and they do their best to kind of like contain all of this. But what's really interesting too is that this press conference is held before Ruppelt, who's the head of Blue Book, before he even gets to like have an investigation or give his findings to anybody. They just hold this presser really fast, and they just come up with a reasoning behind all of it and just move on. And they basically just say they believe the phenomenon was a result of like a temperature inversion, which causes like radar blips. It messes with radar. And it also happened to line up with a few meteors that were burning up in the atmosphere at the time. So people were like misidentifying stars. They were seeing, meteors. The weather inversion happened, or a temperature inversion happened, so it caused radar blips. It was just kind of the perfect storm. And it's no big deal. It's just because everyone is, cognizant or aware of UFOs. It's just a big story that there's nothing here. There's nothing here to see. Move on, basically, is how this presser goes.
I think that's kind of interesting, that they like sweep it under the rug real quick. They don't even try to entertain the idea. You know what I mean? It's not like well, it's possible that there's stuff out there. It's more of a no, 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 no. There's nothing out there.
Yeah, exactly. They're like trying to get ahead of it. And it's this weird situation where the government's like, all right, let's put something together. Let's claim all these things. Don't look into it. Nothing to see here. Move along. It is very suspect. So that's like right after. This is like the immediate after effect of all this stuff. And so that presser comes up. It's funny whenever you research this story, the presser comes up because they talk about how it's the most telegraphed like presser since World War II. Like nothing has had really happened since then, and all of a sudden something's going on. And everyone wants to know about it, and so talking about this room is full of tons and tons of people. And if you read Kevin Randle's book, he basically has transcripts from that presser, and I actually saw a video of Sanford from the presser, and it's all public. But it comes up whenever this story comes up. This presser comes up because it felt like such a classic government brushed under the rug type thing. So now we're going to talk about the investigation that took place. And I want to first start by talking about there's like two investigations. So one happens immediately after July 19th, which is the first incident. And it's really funny because Captain Ruppelt, the head of Blue Book, he's flying into DC on July the 21st. And so no one, I guess, told Air Force intelligence about the incident. So the Air Technical Intelligence Center, or ATIC, nor Blue Book officials were aware that any of this took place. Ruppelt, he lands in DC and he's walking through the airport and he sees the paper, and on the cover is this like UFO sighting. He's the head of the UFO arm of the military, and no one's told him about this. He sees that on a newspaper as he's getting to DC. And what's really interesting is that like his orders don't have him staying overnight in Washington. And so he has to end up just kind of flying home. He doesn't even get to investigate July 19th. But what's really interesting is that President Truman, he heard about all this and he's like, okay, we need a full investigation. And so one is done at Bowling Air Force Base, and then all that information is forwarded on to Ruppelt because Ruppelt is back at Wright Pat, right? So that's where Blue Book is held. And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this first investigation because it's mostly kind of everything we already know or covered at this point. But I do want to point out one quick thing because with this investigation, it's done out of sight of Captain Ruppelt, and basically the return statements from the men in the control tower and various officials, they're all kind of like whitewashed, I guess, and they mostly are like, oh, it's a shooting star, or oh, it's this, it's that. They never really imply that these crafts or UFOs were anything other than either weather related or astronomical related. And so it seems very tailored. Randall's book kind of implies that if it was just this one incident, we probably wouldn't have the pandemonium that ended up occurring, because all these career guys, they weren't going to like recall anything that would compromise their positions. They were all by the book. But we ended up having a second incident, and so things kind of spiral from there. So we're going to focus more on the second investigation, but there was like a debriefing of the people that saw the things on July 19th. But most of the meat of what we know comes from the second investigation.
I mean, that kind of makes sense. You don't want to compromise that. Like, you don't want to, and you don't want the government to think you're crazy.
Yeah, and that's a common trend. I mean, we talked about it, I think, in the Rendlesham Forest incident, and even like the Betty and Barney Hill incident. These people that, and that's even like more recently with the UFO hearings that happened in, I think, like 2021, people aren't going to compromise their ability to fly an aircraft. Imagine you have a license and you're a pilot of, F-22, F-16, some type of like really cool aircraft. If you start saying, hey, I'm seeing some crazy stuff in the sky, you're going to get grounded really fast. You're going to lose your license. You're not going to be able to fly again. So some of these guys that see this stuff, they are going to be by the book. They're not going to say anything that's going to compromise their career. And you're right. They're worried about being reprimanded in some way because they are in this position. They've gotten so far in their career. Now something crazy has happened, but they're not going to put it in writing. They're not going to write down that they saw or experienced something that a normal person will look at and be like, something's wrong with you. This compromises your ability to operate an aircraft or something along those lines.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, you don't want a general in charge of you that thinks he's seen aliens. I mean, it's kind of a scary thought, you know?
Yeah.
And he's like, "Oh yeah, back years ago, I saw this alien flying over," and you're like, are you the one that we're taking orders from?"
Yeah, exactly. That's true. You don't want your superiors to be spouting off things that a normal person wouldn't say. So the second investigation, it's really interesting because now there's been two instances of these UFOs and the entire nation is talking about it, and they're saying like, okay, is there an invasion of DC? And so it's kind of like time to explain what happened. So General Sanford, he's brushing it off as a temperature inversion, which causes radar to malfunction. And they basically, as they go through this investigation, so they already had their endpoint before they had their data, which is never good. Anyways, the second investigation, it has way more insight into what happened and firsthand experiences from that second event. So we're going to jump into that. In August of 1952, James P. Beckett and William W. Wilcox, they provide a summary report of interviews and radar observations, and this report makes its way back to Wright Pat, where Ruppelt and Blue Book are stationed. So this report details that there were up to 12 objects identified on the night of July 26th. When first observed, 4 of the objects flew in a line with each other, about a mile and a half apart. Which is kind of like if you think about that first encounter we talked about in 1947, how I think what Kenneth Arnold saw those crafts flying in formation. That's the only time that this occurs in 1952 when this incident happens. There's only one moment. It's at the beginning of July 26th when the first 4 objects are first observed are flying in some type of formation, but it's very brief. And then everything after that is like just erratic. All these planes are just kind of all these crafts are just kind of flying around. They're flying in ways that normal aircraft, or at least aircraft at the time, couldn't do. One thing during this investigation that I thought was really interesting that I think is important to say is that these objects are referred to as solid returns. And it's important because this indicates they were solid vehicles and not weather phenomenon. So I guess what could happen with radar is that returns can come through, and I'm not sure exactly the language, but when they refer to these objects, they refer to them as solid returns, which essentially just means they're physical objects and not like a weather phenomenon like a cloud or like a fog or anything. It's an actual solid return. At some point, one of the crafts is recorded as only traveling at like 30 or 40 miles an hour, which is extremely slow and unexpected for the air traffic in that location, which I think is like very interesting because we have them traveling what, like 7,000 miles an hour. We have them traveling at like 30, 40 miles an hour. I think it just shows like the how erratic these crafts are moving. If they're able to go that slow and that fast, and our aircraft is only able to travel at like a constant speed or slow down and speed up, there's something going on here. These craft, there's something more than just misidentifying these with other planes, and that's really important to know, is that traveling at that speed in this location would indicate a lot smaller of a craft, and there just wouldn't be those because they're flying into like a commercial airport above Washington National. The other thing I want to talk about is from this report is the F-94 pilot statement. So Lieutenant Patterson, who we talked about earlier, and we talked about this a little bit. So he saw the four lights and he pursued them. And then after the lights go out, they reappeared all around his aircraft. And so he's kind of like, in a way, he's caught the crafts. He's in the midst of all these crafts flying around him, and he's basically like, I don't really know what to do. And he asked the tower, like, hey, what do I do? And they're like, well, I don't know. It just they didn't really know what to do. Once he actually caught them, he was in the midst of all these craft, and all of a sudden they're like, well, yeah, actually, now that you've actually caught them, we don't know what we want you to do in this situation, which I think is kind of funny.
You'd think they'd be like, take some pictures, play some music, see how they respond to that.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing I noted in this was that I thought was like really interesting is the fact that the weather station had determined there was only a 1 degree inversion in the area. And they're talking about this weather inversion and creating this issue that could cause problems with the radar. But the report basically says they checked with the weather station, and the weather was like, oh, it's a 1 degree inversion in the area, which I feel like kind of discredits that weather inversion. If it's only a 1 degree difference, it's just kind of a weird thing. But they really hang their hat on the weather inversion.
I wonder how temperature affects radars, though.
Actually, I'm about to cover that right here, Jason. So hold your horses. We're getting there. The investigation pretty much covers all the things we've already talked about. So I'm going to just cover up a few things here that we haven't. And this plays right into what you're asking me. So one of the F-94 pilots, he explains flying through a location where lights were observed from the ground. He said that it was hazy, dark, turbulent, and had high moisture. I also want to focus in on the crew of the B-29 and what they experienced, because they moved in to investigate. Remember, they were in the area, they cruised in. So they observed, apparently, which I thought was interesting, because the original like presser and all that, it was said that the B-29 airmen didn't see anything. But I'm trying to think where exactly I saw this. It's the investigation. They did see something. They observed 3 amber-edged white flashing lights traveling through the air, leaving yellowish trails behind them. And this was all observed around 9,900 feet. Last thing in this report, before we wrap up the investigation portion and we get into theories, and we'll get to what you were asking me about temperature inversion, there's a report out of Delaware that someone observed a gray cylindrical object with a round top hovering through the air. It had a silvery glare to it, kind of like what was talked about earlier with the bluish white silver aircraft that was over the tree line with the red lights going. So civilians saw this as well and reported it independently from what was said by the military. And so there's actually a picture taken by a man named George Stock from July of 1952 that basically matches this description. It's like a famous picture of like a UFO. You can go online and look at it. George Stock, July of 1952. It's the classic saucer shaped disc with the round top. And that's basically what's described here. So this kind of leads us to our first theory, and this is the answer to your question you asked me a moment ago, Jason. That first theory is it's a weather phenomenon. It's entirely possible that the weather played a factor in like radar disturbances. So what can happen with weather, especially when it's hazy and wet? So we had that pilot that said it was wet, hazy, dark. Radar actually will bend. And so with temperature inversions, it can cause radar waves to bend in a way that pick up ground traffic. So things on the ground, not at 5,000 feet. So what appears to be 5,000 feet on radar, the radar is actually bending under the hazy wet weather and the temperature inversion causing things on the ground to appear as if they're in the sky. And so, one of the F-94 pilots indicated the weather condition was at least present. And then remember the steamboat? And they were like, hey, you're saying there's supposed to be something here. There's not. We do see a steamboat. It could just be that the weather had that perfect condition. The temperature inversion caused some funkiness with the radar. And since it's older, archaic radar equipment, it was picking up ground vehicles and displaying them on their scope.
Interesting. When you think about it, the technology was not that advanced, you know? I'm sure they saw stuff all the time. Probably shouldn't be there just because of age and, glitches.
Yeah, the technology wasn't perfect. And even now, I don't think our technology is perfect, but it's way better than what it was. And so if you had a floor of 5,000 feet, so anything on radar would indicate that something is flying at least 5,000 feet in the air. And then the radar is bent down to ground level and is picking up physical objects on the ground, like moving just like the steamboat cruising along. You would assume that technology just isn't capable of distinguishing between an aircraft and an object on the ground because of the weather conditions. And so that's what the Air Force hangs their hat on. They basically say, even before the reports kind of come out, they just say this is what happened. It was weather conditions on top of a lot of meteor activity and people just kind of being excitable about UFOs right now. It was the perfect storm, and so radar was ineffective. Visuals of meteors and stars were misconstrued as UFOs. Nothing really happened, and so that's kind of our first theory: is that really it was just the perfect storm of natural phenomenon and fault, not really faulty equipment, but just not as advanced technology that really could distinguish between ground stuff and air stuff. So the next theory I want to talk about is there was actually aliens. And this was part of some type of invasion. You have the nation's capital engulfed in flying objects. They're hovering around the White House. They're hovering over the Capitol building. Truman personally shows interest. He's like, something's happening here. I need to know what's going on. The military's involved. Jets are scrambled. Everyone's freaking out. It's at a point in time where there's been several instances leading up to this point. The U.S. government is saying they have at least enough awareness of UFOs that they create a whole bureau to investigate unidentified flying objects. Maybe these aliens are coming into D.C. If they are hovering over the White House and the Capitol building, it kind of makes you wonder, like, yeah, they told us that this was a weather phenomenon, but if, say, aliens pop down, they beam down, they talk to Truman in his office, they beam back up and they roll out. You know what I mean? Like, it could very easily be that, like, first contact. A lot of people talk about aliens kind of showing up around this time, specifically because of the atomic age. Kind of like going back to Star Trek, when warp drive is first discovered and it kind of breaks that prime directive. Right now that warp drive is discovered, they show aliens show up and say, hey, we exist. I know you have warp drive, you can find us now, so we're going to come alongside you and basically tell you that we're here. And so the atomic age happening after World War II coming into full swing, now we have UFOs, aliens visiting our nation's capital. That's like the next kind of theory.
I wonder, like, it's kind of a scary thought, though, because when we go to war, I wonder if they're going to back.
They might just stay out of it. Might just say, okay, you guys can't fight. There's a lot of interesting stories about, like, imagine there's a nuclear exchange and Russia, the US, our military partners in the West, China's military partners, in the East, they all shoot nukes at each other. And as they're in the air, they all are disarmed and they just kind of fall to the ground. That's kind of like, I don't think they would just pick a side. I think what they would do is they'd step in and keep us from killing ourselves, if anything. Or they'd let us wipe ourselves out and they'd come in and they'd clean house and start over, depending on how you look at what aliens could actually be. Again, we could just be livestock to them.
Great thought.
Yeah, that's a spooky thought as we wrap up. The last thing I do want to talk about is the possibility of like a government cover up, like of top secret technology. This is like a tried and true, easy thing to point back to. The government is always trying to cover stuff up, I feel like. We talk about Area 51 and out west, and people like see things in the sky and they say, "Oh, it's something," and the U.S. government's like, "Oh, we don't know what it is. It's a weather balloon," but it's actually their own technology cruising around. There's also that possibility because you remember Skyhook, that balloon they were talking about. That was under wraps. That was top secret. The whole Skyhook thing didn't come out to years and years later when it was declassified. And they're like, "Oh yeah, that pilot that crashed, he was actually chasing Skyhook, which was a top secret balloon. We didn't talk about it at the time, but it was top secret, so we didn't say anything. So it could easily be something like that. I mean, it is flying around bases. I don't really know how that relates to like Fort Knox, that Fort Knox incident, but it's very easily that the government was so quick to try to cover everything up so quickly and cleanly. They could just be they're trying to point fingers, they're trying to point the everybody away from our top secret technology, and that people interpret that as them trying to point fingers away from UFOs and cover up UFOs. But in reality, they're just covering up top secret stuff. Like there was some crafts and things flying around DC that showed up on radar that shouldn't have, and they'll be like, "Oh no, it was weather. It was the weather thing. It was a temperature inversion." Could easily be that. That's kind of our last theory.
Or another theory, China over there is making these weather balloons look like UFO ships. They're just like floating them over our bases, like getting all this information and then just booking them out. We have to have at least one crazy theory.
Yeah, every episode we just have something that's just so off the wall that doesn't make any sense, but we'll let it fly. I'll give it to you, Jason. It could be China with their balloons. So lastly, as we wrap up here, I want to kind of get into what we think. I mean, Jason, I don't know where your mind is right now, but what do you think? What do you coming to here?
Honestly, I could see a lot of it being a government thing. I think that I don't think all of it's government, but I think definitely the government knows more than what they're willing to share. I just have a hard time believing the theory that it's actually aliens, and I know that you dislike that thought because you want so badly for us to be an episode of Star Trek. But I have a I don't know, like it could be aliens for sure. You know, it's a possibility, but I'm more leaning towards the possibility of this is just being government playing with some aircrafts that they are creating, or, even in my opinion, like it's possible that some civilians with lots of money are just making ships and flying them out and about. And, the government's trying to chase them down and shoot them down to make sure that they're the ones that are ahead of all this technology.
I think it's like Elon Musk in 1952.
Yeah. I mean, it's a possibility.
That's funny. I don't think it's in this specific instance. I just don't. I don't feel like this one's aliens. The Betty and Barty Hill, that one is like okay. I keep coming back to something going on there. Rendlesham Forest, yeah. This one to me just kind of feels like the perfect storm. I do think that they're onto something with the temperature inversion causing faulty radar. You know how it goes. I mean, when one person sees something and everyone gets excited and they start kind of seeing things and their own mind takes over and things kind of convert into something bigger than what it actually is. I have a feeling that it had to do with years leading up to like this like UFO pandemonium and the government really starting to get into Project Blue Book and people being like, "Oh, we got aliens cruising around." And then you have some astronomical phenomenon, some weather phenomenon, and all these excited people kind of all coming converging together at the same time. That to me feels like that makes more sense. The only thing I will say that's kind of weird is I come back to that transient from the plate. What the heck was that? How does that fit in? If this truly was like a weather inversion, like a temperature inversion, and an astronomical event with meteors and stuff, what about that plate from the observatory that showed three star-like objects 1 minute, and then in the next hour they were gone? That kind of is a weird thing to me. That doesn't really fit into the puzzle. But I don't personally feel like aliens in this episode. To me, it feels like I kind of agree with the government, which is probably that's kind of a scary thought. But I kind of agree with what was said. It sounds like to me it's their explanation makes sense.
Yeah, the plates were definitely one thing that I find a little like a little scary because that, back in 19 was 1952, right?
Yeah, 1952.
So that's the one thing that I do find a little bit on the scary side. Just because the thought process that there's something so far out there, and that it's, they're living out there, like that is one. I don't know. I would love to see this episode and love to hear the science behind these plates and everything. I think everything in the long run can kind of be explained away. The plates definitely have a little bit more of a solid factor to them that is kind of creepy.
Yeah, it's the transient on the plates is very intriguing. From the YouTube channel Event Horizon, you should pull it up. It's so just go to the show notes and look up. It's a YouTube clip. It's for like 40 minutes long. It's pretty awesome. I watched the whole thing and I was like, I got to include this somehow in this episode because it just fits. And they do mention the UFO flap of 1952 that happened in DC. So yeah, definitely take a look at that. It's pretty cool. All right. So I want to thank everybody, all of our listeners, for tuning in to another episode of The Anecdotalist. I think our UFO alien episodes tend to get the most listens. And I'm always super excited to kind of cycle back around to talk about extraterrestrial encounters. There's just a lot of content here. Like we've split up, I think both of our UFO episodes have been two-parters. This one's not, but it's probably going to be a very long episode just based on how long we've been recording. So there's always a lot of good content here. I always get excited about them. And I really appreciate all our listeners coming back and listening again to another episode of The Anecdotalist. So please remember to leave a review, visit our website, and reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. So thanks again for listening to The Anecdotalist.